While you're listening, go to archpodnet.com/members and support our efforts. Let's get to the show.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Hi out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, for episode 90 of the Rock Art Podcast. We're blessed and honored to have Charles White, who's the director of the Tehachapi Museum. He's going to talk about how to do public outreach with heritage values for Native Americans and understand a bit about culture history and a tad about rock art here and there. See you in the flip-flop, gang. Welcome out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, for episode 90. And we are blessed and honored to have Charles White, who is the director of the Tehachapi Museum, with us today. He's a long-term friend and colleague in this adventure of ours. And I think we'll have an interesting repartee and discussion of some of the things we've done together, get to know Charles a bit, and talk about the nature of trying to communicate the importance of Native American heritage and the nature of perhaps the imagery and the religion and cosmology and value system of Native people. Charles, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's really a pleasure and an honor. How long have we known each other, Charles? It seems like it's been forever.
Going back, I'm not sure. I think it's probably been at least 14 years.
Wow. That's rather amazing. Now, when did you take the helm of the Tehachapi Museum? And you might want to share with our listeners where the town of Tehachapi is.
Well, Tehachapi is located on the Highway 58 coming out of north, although they consider it to be west, but we're northwest of Lancaster, California. So we're in the Tehachapi Mountains. It's a small range that abuts the Sierras. We're a little mountain town. We have a population. The town itself is only about 11,000, but our little trade area we consider to be about 40,000. That includes some outlying areas. And so we're sort of the center for all of those people, although some people do drive the hour to Lancaster or the 45 minutes to Bakersfield for their shopping and other needs. But basically, all of our people locally come into the little town of Tehachapi. And of course, now we have a Walmart, which some people were for and some people were against, but they seem to be pretty busy, and it gives us an option of a place to shop. The museum itself is located on Green Street, which is right downtown. It's the old Kern County Library building, the Tehachapi branch. It's built in 1932, sort of an Art Deco building, fairly small. And we had a project that was completed about 12 years ago, I had been wanting to do some sort of an exhibit for the Kawaii, our local Native American tribe. And they actually had never had any place to show any of their artifacts. So fortunately, things came together and we were able to have the city add on the addition to our museum.
It about doubled the size, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Actually, if you consider the restrooms and the offices, it's more than double the size of the original museum.
Yeah.
We needed some help to finish it off. And even though the city had built the building, we had to finish off the interior. And we were lucky to find a local couple, Jesse and Mark Milano, who have an avid interest in Western type things. And I use that term meaning the cattle industry, ranching, and also Native American. And so we were allowed to finish it off in a first-class style. And we, of course, named it the Milano Gallery. And we couldn't have done it without the help of Harold Williams, who was one of the local elders, and you yourself, Alan. The two of you had been working on a book called The Handbook of the Kawaii, and it was the first large book that was sort of a compendium of a few articles, but mostly things that were written for the book. And of course, the Williams family allowed us to have full access to their photographs. And so we have photographs going back from the late 1800s up through about the 1930s. And so we were able, Alan and Harold were able to pick wonderful photographs for the Handbook of the Kawaii. And even though it's rich in a written word of their history and culture, it has lots of large photographs. So it's a very enjoyable book. In fact, the first publishing sold out, and we were able to find a donor to pay to republish it. And so the second edition, both Harold Williams and Alan agreed to sign over their rights to us. So we were able to produce it, and we've actually sold, I think we ordered 500 of those the second time, and we're down to less than 100 now. So we're hoping to find funding to republish that. It's been very well received, and we still sell them at our museum on Green Street here in Tehachapi at least once a week. We'll have somebody to come in or call about it. So we're still selling those. We were lucky. Harold Williams was custodian of all the baskets that his family had made that they could identify. So we have an exhibit of, the first part of the exhibit had about 8 of the Native American baskets. They don't show a lot of wear. They were made by individuals in the Williams family, and we actually have the names of everyone who made those baskets. And later, he allowed us to have the other baskets in the family collection. There were about 5 more. He said that we handled them and cared for them and insured them and took better care of them than he did. So we were lucky to be able to have those to have on display. They're one of the main points of interest in our exhibit. Unfortunately, Harold passed away a few years ago, but he and his sister were both elders in the tribe and helped us out in many ways. When we were putting the gallery together, as I said, the book, the Handbook of the Kawaii, was being published, and they allowed us to use photographs that were in the book. And Alan particularly helped write the panels, the archaeological panels and the cultural ones that give information about the Kawaii.
So, Charles, before we go into the details, give people a background as to how you came to be part of Tehachapi and the museum and the basis of your interest in Native people or all things historical. How's that?
Well, the way I got involved, I was an art history major in college, and afterwards I worked as consultant to museums around the world, mostly in the United States, but some other countries as well. And when I moved to Tehachapi, I retired here when I was 50, and I wasn't ready to just sit and do nothing. So I joined the museum, and with my knowledge and expertise, I was able to find funding and to figure out ways to do things, because we're a small town and small museums usually don't have much money to do things. And that was the case here. But as we started to do things and improve exhibits and do certain events, we got a little more visibility, and that drew in a lot more people. It not only built our membership base, because as a small museum, we have no funding from any organization or agency. So we have to raise money for special projects. We have to look for larger sums, and we don't charge admission, but many people make donations, and we have a small gift shop. So we've been able to sort of parlay that into a first-class museum. And I say that not being egotistical, because we have people every time I'm working there as a docent, people say what a wonderful small museum this is. And we hear that from a lot of people. So we were lucky to have the money and the expertise to completely renovate the original part of the museum, as well as we did that at the same time we were adding on the Milano Gallery. And so it has a nice flow to it. It still has a feeling of an old building, though, which, we tried to keep.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really got a lot of architectural flavor. When did we do the kickoff or the premiere showing, the grand showing, first ever on the globe, of Talking Stone? When you sold out the theater and we sold the DVDs. That was quite an amazing sort of coup.
Yes, I'm guessing that was about probably 8 or 9 years ago. Alan had worked with a Hollywood producer.
His name is Paul Goldsmith. And yes, we worked 4 years together to put together a documentary film that ultimately was aired on PBS and is still available and for sale through Bradshaw and through the auspices of the California Rock Art Foundation. The key here was we did our world premiere.
That's right. Even though Alan was the brains behind that particular production, I don't remember the length. I think it was about 40 minutes long. Of course, we sold the DVDs at the museum, and we show it. We have a TV screen where we show it pretty continually.
Yeah.
And Harold Williams was interviewed in it, as well as Alan and others. And the producer offered to let us at Tehachapi Heritage League, and I'm sure it was at the instigation of Alan, he allowed us to do the world premiere. So we got one of the local theaters to donate their largest theater, seats 170, and we showed it. The seating was sold out.
You somehow sold tickets of somewhere or other. It was absolutely a sellout crowd. There was standing room only, and it was remarkable. And then when they, after they saw it, we had a quick question and answer, and they went and bought the DVDs.
Yes, the museum is only about just over a block away, and we invited everyone down to the museum, and this was before the time of COVID, and so we had it absolutely packed. You couldn't move in there. There must have been close to 80 people in the museum at any given time, and we had refreshments and wine, and I anticipated, we might sell 8 or 10, and I think we ended up selling more like 120 copies of it.
Oh, yeah.
It was so well done, and people just loved it.
So that was a good example of a public outreach and interpretive sort of platform teaching people about the importance of Native American heritage, cultural values, rock art, all of those different things. The museum all kind of packaged in an interplay that really was a special win-win, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. We have found that there's a keen interest in anything to do with Native Americans, especially the local tribe. We had several of the elders would do either lecture or storytelling. And I'm sure, Alan, many of your listeners are familiar with the Indian stories that were passed down through the generations. Since there was no written language, it was all handed down orally. And they would tell these stories of, for instance, a bird came and landed on a rock, and coyote came, to greet the bird. So there, it's sort of to our current storytelling. It's a little simplistic, but people love to hear it, and they're not doing it right now. But there were language classes being held for not only the Native Americans who were here, but there were other local people, and particularly one historian, John Hammond, who is fluent in the language now. The idea was to keep the language alive. And so they would do these programs, and maybe the elder would tell the story, and then one of his children or grandchildren would give the English equivalent. And then at other times, they would just talk about growing up. Luther Gerardo, one of the elders, was one of our best friends. He would always be willing to do any sort of lecture or fundraiser that we wanted to do.
Why don't we hold that thought right now? We'll pick up the story in the next segment.
Okay.
See you in the flip-flop, gang.
Keep this conversation going by joining our members-only Slack team. There's always vibrant conversations going on over there between members and hosts about the topics we're podcasting about and more. Also get access to our back catalog of bonus material and ad-free shows. You get all this for $7.99 a month or less than $80 US per year if you get the annual subscription. Support archaeological education and outreach by supporting the APN. Go to archpodnet.com/members for details. That's archpodnet.com/members.
Are you listening to this podcast and thinking you'd like to start your own podcast and don't know where to start? Well, Chris Webster, that's me. I'm founder of the APN, and I started podcasting back in 2011. You can learn from my years of experience, and you can do it at your own pace. Head over to propodcastnow.com and click the Learn to Podcast image. My 6 to 8 hour self-guided course will take you from show inception to your first episode, and you'll learn the tools you need to keep it all going and prevent pod fading. That's a real term. You can have access to the materials for as long as you want, and if you stay in for 3 months at least, you'll have lifetime access to the graduates Slack team so you can talk to other people that have taken the course and are managing their own podcasts. Again, head over to propodcastnow.com and click Learn to Podcast.
Welcome back. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and we have with us today a guest scholar who is the director of the Tehachapi Museum and a longtime friend. Well, let's go back a bit. Let's jump back and talk a bit about the conceptualization of how we had to sort of develop a theme and a character for that gallery. I think at one point we were trying to figure out, well, should we make it exclusively the Kawayasu Gallery or should it be multiple themes? I think we ended up talking about it being the exclusive Kawayasu Gallery. And it seems to have been paralleled or sort of, put together in a way to be a companion piece with the book. Now, the book was an interdisciplinary project where everybody got involved. Lots of Native Americans were involved, both the Kawayasu Language and Cultural Center, really any Native American that had an interest in our project. We had meetings regularly there in Tehachapi, and the production took 4 years. 4 years of research and writing to sort of get it together. The graphic designers were volunteers, and they did not charge us to produce the book, which was amazing. And Hammond certainly was a big part of it, but really Janice Williams was very critical, as was Harold, in terms of being central and being at each and every meeting. One of the highlights for me was when we were able to nominate the entire gang, everybody, for an award in Sacramento, the Governor's Award. It was in 2011, I believe, and we won the Governor's Award for Historic Preservation. And everybody attended and were there to receive those plaques and that recognition award. And I think that meant a lot to everybody. Any thoughts on that, Charles?
I think you're right. Of course, for Tehachapi, a project like this is a vast undertaking that normally would be a very expensive undertaking. But as I said, we had the Milanos who kicked in a lot of the money to help with it. And we also had the expertise of Alan, as well as Janice and Harold Williams. And we have a local historian, John Hammond, who is very interested and very knowledgeable about the Kauai Sioux. And so all of their talents came to us at no cost. We were just very lucky to be able to do what we did and have such a first-class gallery. We have a murals program in town, historical murals. And one of those murals depicts Kauai Sioux village that was partly imaginary. It was based on historical fact, but in order to get the mountains and the one lake and other elements all in the same picture, things had to be, there was a little bit of artistic license, but the focus of it was not necessarily the background. It was showing the Native Americans going about their daily tasks. There's a small little scene of a man teaching his son how to flint knap to make a projectile point. There are women teaching the girls how to weave baskets. There's the actual houses that the Native Americans lived in were called kanhis in their language. Kanhi means home or house. And so there's a depiction of those in the mural. And so what we were able to do, the problem sometimes in designing an exhibit like this is that you've got some artifacts. You've got some baskets, you've got pictures of rock art, you've got projectile points, and they're rather static and they don't tell much of a story to the average person. So what we did, we took sections. We had someone photograph this large mural and we took sections of it and used those in the background, showing the various tasks that the Native Americans were doing, the Kauai Sioux. And we sort of created a story of how they processed the acorns for their food, which was their main source of food. There's a section on basket weaving, and they're interesting things that people on their own can sort of infer the meaning of. And at times when we're going to have crowds there, we will actually have a docent in that gallery to talk to people and point out these things and explain to them the way of life of the Kauai Sioux. And we also, nearby, we have a state park. It's called Tomo Kanhi. Kanhi, of course, means home, as I mentioned, and Tomo means winter. So it was their winter home. And it's probably about 6 miles, maybe not even that far from downtown. And you can only view the park in the company of a ranger. So on Saturday mornings in the fall and the spring, when the weather's conducive, there are guided tours, and they meet at the museum. And either myself or one of our other docents who have learned about the Milano Gallery will actually give them a tour of the gallery and point out various things. For instance, we'll show them the picture of the Kanhi and tell them that when they get to the park, the rangers will show them a ring of rocks because they place rocks around the bottom of this circular house to keep the animals and vermin out. And so when they are pointed out as what's left of where a Kanhi would be, in their mind they can visualize the Kanhi. And there are other examples of things that we do like that to just educate them somewhat on the culture so that once they get into the state park, they can visualize things. This year in 2022, the first tour is September 24th. So that's a Saturday. They only can take about 16 people on a tour because otherwise it can damage the environment there. And almost all the tours are sold out. We always have people clamoring for those.
What's remarkable about Tehachapi is there is so much history. There's prehistory. There's native ecology. And it's such a, I don't know what you call it, a living, breathing, natural area that has a lot to offer in terms of just visually and experiencing a bit of nature. I guess that's the best way to put it. There's a lot of people that appear to be attracted to Tehachapi because of its beauty and the changing seasons, the natural environment, and sort of the culture of the people. Is this correct, Charles?
Yeah, Tehachapi attracts a lot of people from more crowded suburban areas. They come to Tehachapi and they're just amazed at the small town atmosphere, how friendly everyone is. And fortunately, so many of those people come to the museum. And it's odd because I have people that come in when I'm working there. Always have people who come in and say, well, I've lived here 20 years and I've never been to the museum. And that amazes me because I'm a museum person, grew up loving museums, and actually worked as a consultant to museums for a while. So for people to not realize, what's here, I just find that amazing.
Yeah, me too. And I've talked to people that work and live in Tehachapi, and it's surprising that they don't know that there's a state historic park, that the Indians still live in Tehachapi and are rather prominent and recognized for a variety of reasons. And there we are. But for whatever reason, I think over the years, we've been able to do some interesting things together to help promote and publicize and recognize Native people, and also to sometimes even repatriate, if you would, interesting objects. Do you remember when we got that basket back from the family?
Yes. The area where the state park is in Sand Canyon, which is kind of, a lot of people who live out there are off the grid, although they do have some electricity out in that area. But there was a family that lived in Tehachapi in the 40s and 50s. The father was a geologist that worked with, at that time, I think it was called Monolith Cement Plant, which is adjacent to Sand Canyon. But they lived in Sand Canyon, and the four children spent their time out digging and looking, and they dug up a lot of arrowheads and scrapers and things like that. But they also acquired 3 Native American baskets. The Kwaisu baskets are somewhat rare because there was no one in town that encouraged them to make them to sell. So most of the ones they made to use or to give as gifts. But there was one store in town, and he would trade Indian baskets to the individuals who needed groceries and supplies. But generally, there was not a lot of baskets made for trade. So they're rather rare. But this family had 3, and now it's been about 12 years ago. They had contacted me they wanted to return 2 of the baskets to the museum. So they were coming. One son lives in Boston and the daughter lives in Anaheim, and the 2 of them were coming with baskets. And we arranged for a nice lunch with Harold and his sister, and Alan was there. And they came to present the baskets, and I thought they were presenting them to the museum, but they presented them to Harold. They said, Harold, these are Native American baskets that we're returning. We want to repatriate them. And so they gave them to Harold and for his family. And they are among the baskets that we have on display now. So that happens periodically. We have another basket that does belong to the museum that someone repatriated and gave back to us. So we own that one. And actually, we have a second one that we were able to buy. A woman who lived in Mojave was moving to Arizona, and she was going to sell it once she got there. And we heard about it, and we were able to raise the money and buy it. So we do have a few of our own. But the Eisenmans, as I said, the four children, and unfortunately, one or two of them have died now. They've been kind to the museum and given us various things, but they gave us a collection of arrowheads that they had picked up as children. And Alan went through and divided them up into different periods. And it's an important part of our exhibit on archaeology. They go back to 6500 BC.
What do you use for appointment and task scheduling? I used to constantly move things around in my calendar that were just tasks I needed to do in favor of meetings. Now I let an intelligent AI do that with Motion. In Motion, all I have to do is create tasks with a soft or hard deadline, state how long I think it will take, and whether it can be broken up, and Motion does the rest. It puts the task where it's a best fit for me getting it done by the deadline. The scheduler then puts appointments with people wherever they schedule and moves the tasks around them. Support the APN with a little kickback if you sign up, and try Motion for free at www.archpodnet.com/motion. That's archpodnet.com/motion.
Did you know we have lots of great shows on the Archaeology Podcast Network? Head over to ArchPodNet.com and you can see all the shows that are currently producing podcasts. Scroll down a bit more and you'll see some great shows from the past that still have great content. Search for your favorite shows on your podcasting app or listen right on the page at ArchPodNet.com.
Welcome back, gang. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, with segment 3 on the Rock Art Podcast, episode 90, with our guest scholar, Charles White. Charles, I thought in this final segment, we do a bit of philosophy and reflection. What's it like to be at the helm of a small museum, and what's been your favorite, accomplishments, things that you think really hit your stride and made a difference in the community?
Well, I think, as you know, I had worked as a consultant to museums before I retired. And in doing that, I had a small little part of major exhibitions, because I would work with like the LA County Museum or the Houston Museum of Fine Arts or the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, mostly actual paintings, but some of them were historical, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and things such as that. So I had a small part of it. The thing about working for a small museum is that in my case, it was just waiting for someone to kind of come and take control and bring it into a new being, because it had already been established for about 30 years, but had, not a lot of attention and nobody really who had any museum experience. So I was able to discern which of the artifacts that we had, not necessarily the Native American, because we didn't have many at that point, but just other artifacts concerning agriculture and mining and whatever. And I was able to decide, well, these are not really important or of the quality, to tell a story. So I was able to, when we were closed for that time, the Milano Gallery was being built, and we remodeled the front. I had a lot of time to go through the exhibits and winnow out things that really didn't belong there. And after we reopened, after the remodel, a lot of people would come in and say, oh, you have so much more now, when in actuality, I had taken out about half of what was there, because there would be redundancies and things that were not described. just as I mentioned earlier, in the Milano Gallery, just objects there without some sort of explanation or interpretive panels don't really mean much. So we were able to put things together in a different way to tell a story. For instance, we have a section on the founding of the city, which even though it was started in 1876 when the railroad came through, it wasn't incorporated until 1909.
Wow.
So I was able to tell bits and pieces of that history. And also we have a recreation of blacksmith shop. And there were lots of artifacts that just naturally fit in there. And we had someone about 3 years ago offer us a painting that had been in a meat market here back in the 1940s. And it's a picture of a huge cow with a wide frame, and all around are burned into the wood are brands from some of the local ranches. So,
Wow.
you know, all of that helps to tell a story. And that's what I've strived to do with our permanent exhibits, is to give people a chance to decipher for themselves, you know, the history of Tehachapi.
What I'm hearing is that what you did was to take the museum and begin to focus in on the important objects that can be showcased, and then transmit a story, a compelling story, an interesting story, so that people will learn something and be educated and also entertained.
That's true. We're such a small museum that we can't devote a lot of space to one topic. And there are certain things that I would like to be able to showcase. Like, we have nothing at all on the Hispanics they were here from the beginning, that helped to settle Tehachapi, and also the Basque people. We do have across the street from the museum an old house that was moved to the site about 1900 from a site where businessman thought the railroad would be coming through. And when it didn't come through, everybody wanted to be here in Tehachapi. So some of the buildings were moved into town, and one of the old houses is right across the street from the museum, and we've restored it to 1900 to 1930. It's got a beautiful garden, which we have just in the past 3 years been trying to renovate and replant. And so there's lots of ongoing things that all fit together to tell part of the story of Tehachapi. And most of our large railroad objects are now in a railroad museum, which is about 3 blocks away. And I actually designed that museum and also arranged it in such a way that it tells a comprehensive story. And it's actually more popular than our museum, partly because we have the historic Tehachapi Loop here, engineering marvel that gets the trains over the hill. It was too steep for the steam engines. So there's a lot of railroad buffs that come here, people that have moved here that live down near the loop just so they have a view of the trains at all times. So it's been gratifying to me to put this all together. And I've learned a lot about the history. I really knew very little of the railroad history, and actually very little of the Native American history, but just from reading and studying and talking to Alan and the elders, I've learned quite a bit.
I think what's been interesting to me is like I've said before, when I spent the 4 years with Harold and Janice, I learned more about Native culture, about Native American culture, indigenous culture, you know, the Native people that lived in the Tehachapis and in the Western Mojave Desert. I had been studying them for 40 years. And I learned more in 4 years than I did in 40 years. I learned stories. I learned language. I learned the dictionary and ethnogeography. We wrote a whole section on ethnogeography. Oh, my word. We had probably over 100 different locations that we had native names for the various places that were known by the native people, and they had significance in their language, and they had stories that were told and associations, et cetera, et cetera. And I even spent time with a graphic designer, and we put together an enormous map that sits on your wall to this day that had never existed before. It tried to show the major villages and the areas that the native people had trafficked. So it became a bit of a centerpiece for others to understand how widely the Kawayasu traversed, that there was a desert group and a mountain group. And in fact, they were heavily influenced by the desert culture in the Great Basin. They spoke a language that was kindred to the entire Desert West. So on and on. It's an interesting journey, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. So much of my knowledge came from talking to people such as the elders and yourself. And of course, John Hammond, our local historian, who has made his life's work knowing everything there is about Tehachapi, including the Kawayasu. And they were really happy and proud and supportive of what we did. When we had our grand opening, we had set up chairs for the tribal members, and we were surprised that there were about 60 who came.
Wow.
They're so assimilated and intermarried. Most of them are, not as interested in keeping up their history as others are, but they were really pleased that we did something like this for them. And so it's been good for them, and it's been good for us, because I would say half the people who come into our museum are very interested in the Kawayasu, and they spend a lot of time there in the Mamano Gallery.
Well, it's interesting. When I worked with John Hammond and I worked with Harold Williams, the one thing that really spurred me on for the 4 years we did our work together was it just seemed that anthropologists, archaeologists, the general public, and just the people in general did not realize that there was a story here. The native people were here. They were here for hundreds and thousands of years, and they continue to be here to this very day. And there's a tremendous amount known about them, and that was something that urged me, because when I read many of these reports, compliance reports that had to do with cultural resources management and dealing with various discoveries of archaeological materials or not, they would put snapshots in and say there's nothing known about the Kawayasu. And I would say, well, I don't think that's an accurate appraisal. And even their most prominent anthropologist who's associated with them said that their culture was dead and that they had become extinct. And that's not true either. Just because native people don't live in counties, or don't harvest or don't hunt as much or harvest native plants as much as they did in the past, or even if they don't speak the language as they did in the past, they still know that they're Indians, they know they're Native Americans, they know their heritage, they know their kinship, they know who's related to whom, and they have a tremendous pride and connection with the land. And that's something that one never loses.
Yes, and unfortunately, they don't have tribal recognition. We've worked with some of the elders. Apparently, it's very expensive to try to get your tribal recognition, because the attorneys charge so much to if you can get your foot in the door. So we've helped them on a very small basis. When they've made trips to Washington, we've helped them with travel expenses and that sort of thing. But they don't have their tribal recognition yet.
And most of the tribes, most of the tribelets and groups throughout California do not have federal recognition. Very few, contrary to popular opinion, are not casinoed and not federally recognized. And it's a political situation as much as a financial situation. And the government in general does not want to see more tribes federally recognized because that opens it up to more, the casinos and gambling and other things along those lines. But so it's an interesting time, and I just mentioned this in passing, but there is a group of the Kauai Sioux that were on the Tejon Ranch that have been approved for a casino, and it's going to go in here in the next 6 months to a year. It'll be there on Highway 5, and I bet it's going to be a tremendously successful one because that's one of the most busiest arteries in all of California. So just an interesting sidebar.
Yes.
And with that, I think you can sign off, Charles, and give us some, reflections to think about vis-a-vis this dialogue.
Well, I'm very proud of all of the projects that we've done, including the Araya House. We've just completed a DVD on the Tehachapi earthquake of 1952. This is the 70th anniversary, and we were able to produce a really wonderful 20-minute video. We have the original cemetery, the old Pioneer Cemetery. That's under our care. We try to keep it cleaned up. There are not a lot of headstones there, but we do have some drawings of where people are buried. We do scholarship every year to a high school student, hopefully one that's going to go into the study of history. We do various programs throughout the year. In fact, in October, we're showing a silent film at one of the local theaters. It was the first silent film filmed in Tehachapi, and I believe it was 1915, around that time period. And we know we have a lot of the old photographs of Tehachapi from that time, and the buildings are identifiable in the silent film. So we're looking forward to that.
It just continues. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of things to interpret. There's a community that cares about its natural and cultural history. And it's a fine sort of mix, a medley, and a wondrous relationship that can be born from those people that live in Tehachapi or that are interested in learning more about it. So
yes, it
with
is.
that, I think we should sign off and tell all of our listeners, if you ever get to Tehachapi, look up the museum and go in and check it out. I think you'll be pleased.
Well, thank you, Alan, for this opportunity.
It's a blessing, Charles. It's been a long time in coming, and I'm so happy to have been a platform to share some of your insights. See you later, gang. See you in the flip-flop.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.archpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
This is Chris Webster, founder of the APN and one of the chief editors. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. If you want to keep the conversation going and support us along the way, go to archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. And thanks for listening.